Yeah, am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you're audible, but just please speak a little bit louder.
Yeah, I think that's a recurrent problem. I'll do that in my speech. Um, my preferred pronouns are he, him. I'll take POIs through unmuting yourself. I might take one. Starting in 3, 2, 1. It is very easy to think that democracy is always good. If your first instinct was to vote for opposition, congrats, that's where you're wrong. Because on opening government, we reject the notion that democracy always works in all instances, that it's a virtue in and of itself, that having a flawed democracy, which probably doesn't represent people, is better than having no democracy at all. I'm going to do several things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about how the narrative actually plays out. Second, I'm going to talk about why this narrative is harmful on a societal level. Thirdly, why this entrenches the legitimacy of Western democratization that exists. Before that, I want to just be really clear about where we stand in this debate. We think that democracy is probably good and it has its benefits, right? That it has benefits for a specific type of people and specific circumstances in which it exists. I think the unique burden of opposition is to prove why democracy is always going to work in all instances when the narrative perpetuates that democracy is always the thing that you have to turn to. So I'm going to briefly characterize how the narrative plays out. This is my first issue, right? I think a narrative is essentially about generalization. It's about being very absolutist and it's about simplification. So opposition cannot come up here and also co-opt the benefit by saying we're going to have a narrative that is very nuanced. I think what exists in status quo is much more simplistic than that. It's to say that individuals feel that it's better to live in a flawed democracy rather than no democracy at all. And I think it applies to all layers of society. First of all, on an individual level, we just have a natural instinct for us who actually live in democracies that is probably the best way to live, as opposed to living somewhere like China, where it's probably not as democratic. But it also applies in a macro level scale, right? Whole countries, for example, such as Western countries, in which the notion of democracy probably first emerged, in which individuals have individual rights and have these Western values, as opposed to Asian sort of communalism, means that countries also vilify other systems of government, other systems of coming to a consensus, and other systems of decision making. It looks like how the US hates China because they don't have democracy, for example, or the US has this notion of trying to save the people in the Middle East by democratizing those areas. So I want to talk about why on a societal level, this narrative is probably harmful. The thesis of this argument here is that democracy isn't always good in a lot of instances. And I think with this narrative, individuals themselves and society as a whole can self-justify to keep holding on to that system that doesn't work best for them. So the assumption here that I want to sort of break is that democracy is not just a macro government thing, right? It's not just about having a president. It's also about how you interact with other layers of society. It looks like how, for example, on a level of the city, for example, whether or not you should submit some authority to the government, whether or not you probably have to respect your vote, whether or not you have the right to protest certain things. I think there are two or three big problems with this. The first is that you create a narrative in which people put too much faith in themselves, because some types of circumstances that necessitates democracy is probably good, but there are other circumstances that necessitates a swift government power, for example, or to bypass that sort of democracy, not to a great extent, but to cut some of those corners, right? The first example of this is where when people are not trusted enough to make these decisions. I think what happens under opposition is that, for example, people say they don't want to wear masks because they vote for this, right? That they are able to sort of show that just I voted for this and therefore it is my right. I think that's where individuals self-justify that because democracy is always good, your rights will always have to be respected. I think the culture that we want then under side government is where there are some things that should be accepted and should be an absolute truth. The government should be able to bypass, for example, your ability to sort of vote whether or not you want to wear masks due to the fact that there's literally a public health crisis that exists. And I want to preempt the slippery slope that I think opposition will naively take for this, right? That, this will lead to a blind faith to dictatorship. And this is where I want to justify, right? It's not true because we say that there's a special circumstances that necessitates this. I think a choice is good when there is a morally acceptable threshold that is already passed. The fact that you have a more urgent power means that you probably can undermine that democracy to some extent and not always say that it is good. The second thing to point out is when people just don't know about the long-term implications of things. So for example, like in government of Greece, right? They were in very big debt and the government wanted to do austerity. Then what happened, right? The people protested and said that this is their right to democracy to get their money back. I think this is suicidal in the future because it means you're not actually solving the debt crisis in Greece. The several layers I want to point out after this is that whenever a majority wins, then it's absolute because, hey, it's a democracy. That means all decisions are cannot be compromised. The third thing to say is that I want to distinguish between good democratic conduct and democracy in itself. Because what we defend under side government is probably good democratic conduct, right? So for example, when there is like elected forms of government and there's a judicial that can check and balance those sort of things. Like the parallel example to this is that debating can be good or bad. Debating can be very toxic, but if you say that debating in and of itself is good, I think you always justify the toxicity in the sense that you always say that it's a good, regardless of how you carry that out. I want to preempt this, preempt the opposition line of logic that probably says, oh, but governments can be bad. Governments and not having democracy can be very bad, right? The first of which to point out is that that's not what we're defending. The second to point out is that government in its ideal form can exist under our side of the house. Under their side, you always have these bad systems of governments and you always justify that to be the case. Now I want to talk about why it entrenches the legitimacy of Western democratization, right? The thesis of this argument is that this happens mostly like Western countries where they believe they are self-superior because they have this notion of democracy being an absolute good that they have to instill on other people, that they are morally righteous in doing this action to intervene to other countries and instill democracy. I think there's two harms of this. The first is that you have direct intervention to other countries. So for example, in the Middle East, where you see that dictatorship probably doesn't work, regardless of whether or not it works, these other systems of governments are not willing to be tried because you always go to democracy, you always go to Western countries, they want to democratize those systems, even though other systems are probably valid. The second thing to point out is that even if it's not in direct cases of intervention, I think it's indirect cases of isolating yourself because other countries are not democracy. Look at how the US doesn't want to trade with China because they justify this by saying on principle, China, these horrible things, China doesn't engage to its people and give them the rights of democracy they deserve. I think the harm of this is that you're not trading with countries that probably need it the most, even though in areas such as China, even though they don't have democracies, a one-party system is equitable to its people because they probably share resources equitably in that sense. If you have a democracy in China, it probably leads to some Uyghur parties probably not getting the representation and always being shut down anyway. I think what I want to be very clear about as to why OG wins this debate is we characterize to you that this happens on a macro scale, and on an individual scale, it harms the discussions of people very proud to stand in opening government.
All right, thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. Now to open the case of OO, I would like to call upon leader of opposition here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. If everyone's ready, I'm going to start my speech.
I'm ready.
Thanks. Democracy is a virtue. And if you're a pessimist, congrats, you're contributing to the demise of wider society. And as the opening government, we absolutely assert this narrative that democracy is good for our society. We want this narrative. We don't regret it one bit. We see democracy as inherently good by the values that it presents. So two main issues within this argument. First, why principally democracy is inherently morally good. And secondly, why we win on a practical level in terms of how we affect the world. A bit of clarification before I go into my two main points. The opening government talked about people not wearing masks and how this is justified because of democracy. This does not make sense. This is a completely mismatched example because if there's something morally wrong, democracy doesn't allow that, exactly because we are saying democracy is a virtue. For example, that's why democracy is against murder as an entire concept, because it is morally wrong. Democracy does not stand for anything that is morally wrong. Therefore, this argument is irrelevant. Now on to my first principle argument. They argue that democracy is not principally correct. But how can you say something that is morally good? And in this, I will set two criteria. A, you can say something is morally good by understanding, first of all, that something that is morally good does not mean that it is flawless. There has to be a flaw in anything because this is a law of nature. Everything in the world has a flaw, but something can be morally good. a virtue when it has a correcting mechanism to mitigate said flaw. So democracy doesn't have to be perfect in all instances, and we don't have to prove this despite what opening government believes. Secondly, how can something be morally good if it gives agency to a lot of people, if it gives control, choices, protection? And democracy fulfills these two parameters, and I will break these down into two reasons. First, the mitigation of flaws. Democracy has a corrective mechanism built into its inherent core values. Voting. Society has control in democracy. What does this mean? It means that even if democracy might have flaws later, there are correcting mechanisms for people to cast their ballot to out the current leader. So they fulfill the parameter of this corrective mechanism to be morally good. Comparatively, the other systems such as dictatorship or monarchy, there are no correcting mechanisms within this debate because there is no casting ballot. There is no giving people power. This translates to democracy being the only political system that has a correcting mechanism, and this is justified to be a virtue. Even if you have a correcting mechanism within this other form of government, such as dictatorship can be toppled down, the cost is huge. The cost is people die, civilians are suffering, civilians are starving, instability. Comparatively, democracy has much less costs, and with all of this, we prove that it fulfills the parameter of a mitigation factor. Secondly is the availability of agency. Democracy gives agency to people later. It gives minorities a vote. That is at its core the values of democracy in the first place. We concede, yes, there are cultural and there are different cultures and circumstances, but this is not inherent. This is tailored by the most powerful individuals within the society. Government cannot argue that there are different circumstances for different systems because these systems are not necessarily what the people need. They're tailored by those in power for those in power. Democracy is not like that. It is more valid and gives agency because it's a collective interest to the entire people. Because democracy fulfills both of these parameters, it is morally good. Now onto my second issue, why we win on a practical level in this debate. Let's talk about practicality. What would the world look like on our side of the house? Two arguments for this. First, the opening government claimed that democracy would justify Western imposition, etc. But what do they impose? Where do they impose it? In what type of country? To countries that are already suffering, where citizens are simply gears in a dictatorship machine. By value, this is not necessarily a political maneuver. Even if it is a political maneuver, it comes with a benefit. It comes with humanitarian aid. It comes with the ability to collectivize. So a world where democracy exists is a virtue is better, even if it justifies these types of actions because it helps the countries that are suffering. Without Western imposition, they would live in suffering anyway. So if this exists in both sides of the house, what's exclusive is that these countries that are suffering have choices on our side of the house. Secondly, why the world where democracy exists is better. They might argue that this creates extremism or coup d'etats as is inherent in the Myanmar situation, but this is untrue. In that context, who would the supporter of the military be in the first place? Let me answer that for you. Brainwashed individuals who are habituated and don't have a choice anyway. So this happens not because the narrative of democracy is a virtue, but because there is a political movement and political strategy. Even in countries like Egypt, where democracy made the countries unstable, this didn't happen because democracy is a virtue. It happened because there was a failed transfer of knowledge and failed transfer of virtues. This is something that we can prevent with technicalities, and it did not come from the narrative of democracy being a virtue. When we impose this narrative of democracy being a virtue, we incentivize other countries who transfer these virtues of democracy to make sure that the countries they impose it on still are exercising the correct virtues of democracy. So we can solve it on our side of the house. But what would happen if this existed on both sides of the house? Well, it's asymmetrical because we have the ability to mitigate and check and balance this condition. The militaries that are cooping and claiming true democracy, even in a bad democracy, can be mitigated and corrected. This can be done with two different ways. First, through collectivized movement. There can be movements that help to prevent this cooping and this asymmetry of power. Secondly, through international support. Multiple times throughout history, when countries are suffering, other countries lend their support through giving trade embargoes or giving sanctions. And this is the way that these countries can avoid that our side makes it asymmetrical. Secondly, this is exclusive because it matters what matters is what people think when democracy is a virtue. People will see this extremism as undemocratic. Without this narrative of democracy being a virtue, people have less incentive to go out and fix these issues in the first place. But we need people to fix these issues. And the only way to do so is by letting them see that democracy is a virtue. When we have the idea of democracy being a virtue in society, people are then incentivized to try and help defend this democracy as a virtue in the first place. People are then incentivized to help democracy last as long as possible. For these two reasons. First, why principally democracy is something that is morally good, and secondly, why we win on a practical level in how we benefit the world around us, we are proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. Now to continue the case of OG, I'd like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister here.
Check. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, give me one moment.
Oh, DPM, are you okay? You're mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. My gender pronoun is nothing. You can call me anything you want. My preferred method of receiving POI is via chat, so please don't unmute your mic. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are a lot of precedences in the world in which a democratic process results in heinous outcomes. The election of Trump was justly won, in which he won the majority of the electoral college. The election of Hitler, literally, in part, it is involved by genuine support coming from the society to him. We think that opening opposition really dismisses Dazzle's contextualization as to there is a difference between the concept of democracy in itself and the in-depth application that is much more nuanced to that, and that's why we think that they missed this debate entirely. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Number one, I'm going to talk about the inherentness of democracy. Is it morally good? Secondly, I'm going to talk about the impact of the world at large. This discusses about how will society behave and also the interaction of people in the much more international relations level. So first of all, let's talk about, is democracy inherently morally good? So the first thing they claim here is that democracy does not stand for morally abhorrent thing. For example, democracy does not abhor murders. There are three responses to this. Number one, I'm just going to flag it here. Doesn't have to distinguish the concept between the concept and like the good democratic conduct that is completely unresponded. Now I'm going to add two more things here. The second thing to add is that there is a difference between a basic concept and the in-depth application for such concept. So for example, if you talk about democracy, there are a lot of types of that, right? There is representative democracy. There is direct democracy, in which like you literally come to the town hall and like vote for things, while representative democracy, in which you vote for for someone to represent you. If you say that democracy is inherently good, that means that both of these types of democracies, representative and direct democracies, is good. And this is basically our line of logic here. What we are trying to say is that sometimes people skew democracy to their own self-interest, like all of the examples that me and Dazzle have told you, which is why there is a difference between the in-depth application in itself and this kind of bad application will be perceived as virtuous, because people think that, okay, it's for democracy, but it's democracy nonetheless, like it's still good. And this is the kind of thing that we want to avoid, ladies and gentlemen. That is the second structural reason as to why this is their argument isn't correct. And lastly, note the inherentness of this. And like this is just to further emphasize my second point. Inherentness means absolutism. Inherentness means that regardless of the circumstances, this is absolutely good. And these three reasons goes on to show as to why that argument is invalid. So let's move on to the metrics that they say. They bring two metrics here. Number one, they bring the idea that democracy can be self-correcting via voting, and like this doesn't exist in other systems. And secondly, they talk about how this gives agency, and agency is inherently good. Let's engage to this one by one. First of all, let's talk about self-correcting mechanisms. I have two responses here. Number one, even if you don't talk about democracy, some correcting system style exists despite being different in the form of voting. For example, for example, in some authoritarian regimes, there is a council. There is like some local representation which are not necessarily voted, but still understand the situation coming from their people. Like, for example, we have this in the case of China, in Iran as well, for example, which goes on to show that a certain degree of self-correcting in the way in which government wants to govern is still going to exist under our side. And of course, they have the incentive to at least care for such people because they wanted to be stable. Again, the case study of China is doing very, very well right now. Number two, again, we don't think that this is very not naive for them to think that just because you vote, that means you can have a self-correcting mechanism. Trump is literally voted in power, okay? So I don't think we can just take this argument at face value. So I dealt with the first metric. Second metric, then let's talk about how this gives agency. One thing to point out here is that agency comes with a trade-off. When you have rights, you can have positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights entails an obligation that other people have to you. So for example, if I have a right to healthcare, that means that other people need to provide healthcare for myself. But the problem here is, if you perceive that agency is self-absolute, you are necessarily neglecting the other obligation that you have to other people. Ladies and gentlemen, because it gives agency to myself. I don't want to pay tax to provide healthcare to those poor people. I don't want to pay, I don't want to wear masks because I have agency. Again, this layer necessarily plays out into our case in which we say that agency per se is not good. It should be evaluated in a context in which it applies. And that is why we say that democracy is not inherently morally good. It is inherently good in some people, in some circumstances, which is basically the case of opening government. So that concludes my first question. Second question, let's talk about how the world at large will react. Okay, so on the societal level, what we told you is that people will put too much faith on themselves and people will act too much majoritarianly, never been responded by opening opposition. Their response-ish to this is by saying that people will have less incentive to fix things if you don't have democratic narrative as something that is virtuous. We don't think this is true. In the case study of Germany, for example, people literally think that the Christian Democratic Union, which is the party of Merkel, is a dictator, and like that is why far-right parties such as Alternative für Deutschland rises. But do note here that Merkel is voted into power democratically. Okay, she's voted into power continuously because she is just that popular. And the reason as to why there is little checks and balances to even anticipate why AfD rises in the first place is exactly because of this narrative. People perceive that, okay, she is voted into majority, so who cares about the other minority have said? Like, they still have other representation and opposition anyway. What I'm trying to say is that we must be continuously cautious about how democracy is applied. Again, we don't oppose the concept of democracy in itself, but what we want is exactly evaluation, which is exactly what they want on the opening opposition side of the house. But let's move on. On the bigger level, right? So they claim that democracy is absolutely good. It gives people the choice to not suffer. In Egypt, the failure happens because of failed transfer of knowledge and not because of democracy is bad in itself. I have two responses to this. Number one, there is another case study which proves that argument wrong. In Iraq, for example, after Saddam Hussein has been toppled, the Sunni majority felt sidelined when the democratic process happens, and they literally tries to coup against the government, and that results into the shit show that we have in Iraq today. That is caused by the attempt of the United States and Western-backed allies to implement democracy in that area. So it's not because of failed transfer of knowledge per se, but it's because of the inherent cultural incompatibilities between the Iraqi society, which are very tribal, which are very hierarchical, and like they accept absolutism, as opposed to democracy in which you are less hierarchical and you put much more emphasis to negotiations and like common agreement. But secondly, when they talk about people have choice to not suffer, again, ladies and gentlemen, China is quite stable. Bhutan has the highest happiness index in the world. All of this goes on to show that they need to provide a structural reason as to why democratic process inherently, regardless of circumstances, is inherently good. We don't need to provide the burden to the counterfactual because we say that this is circumstantial in basis. We cannot simulate the world, and we should just take reality as it is. We are very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that fine speech. Now to continue the case of OO and close the opening half of the debate, I'd like to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, wait. Wait, where's my timer? Okay. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about the principle, whether democracy is a virtue. Through chat, please. Democracy is a virtue and whatnot. Second, I'm going to talk about what does the world look like, right? So firstly, about the principle. So basically what they're trying to say is that the world is circumstantial. People have different culture, different places, yada, yada, right? But the first thing is that you have to question, right? The creation of this culture, whether or not this is something inherent and whether or not this is something that is justified. The subjective thing about culture is that it is tailored by this party who are ruling at the particular time. It means that these tribal leaders dictate what the life of would look like for this kind of individuals and whatsoever. So we say that this is not something that is the preference of this individual, because this preference is never true at all to begin with. But second of all, understand that look how they like try to gauge the subjectivity that people have, and how then they try to value the potentiality that people deserve and whatsoever. That's funny, because the way that they value and gauge this validity of people's circumstances are through the perspective of democracy, by saying that this is people's right to eventually have this to begin with. So I don't necessarily understand why the ability for them to eventually, like, to say that democracy is not a virtue, by using the same like perspective to value some other thing as something that is acceptable on their side of the house. So what does it mean? It means that you cannot gauge the idea of morality based on the circumstantial thing. It means that on our side of the house, the parameter that we give to gauge morality is something that is necessary. The idea of morality needs to have corrective mechanism, and the idea of morality needs to give agency to the individual. Understand what we posed is really important, because number one, if you're talking about corrective mechanism, we say, and we engage to that, we say that democracy is not flawless, but something that is something that is flawed is not necessarily something that is not a virtue to begin with, because morality comes with inherent corrective mechanisms when you can topple down bad leaders like Trump, Hitler, and whatsoever like examples that they give on their side of the house, right? This is extremely important because number one, it answers the concern about the flaw of democracy that OG is constantly trying to bring, but second of all, it also answers principally with them, even if there is a bad practice of democracy, this is something that is virtuous because this cause could eventually be corrected, right, ladies and gentlemen? But second of all, we've also proved to you about agency, right? Giving choices and whatsoever. But why then this is something that is important? This is engaging to OG. If it's true that circumstantiality is something that we should uphold the most as a value, it means that to give people a choice, to dictate what kind of system that they want to have, only existed by they having a vote on, or the ability to cast ballot and to determine what kind of government system that they want to have. This is exactly why democracy is referred to, because it gives them agency to do so, to tailor what kind of society and civilization that they wanted to have to begin with. And in comparative, when democracy is not something that is good and the absence of democracy on their side of the house, these people cannot exercise that. So it proved that by these two parameters, maybe it's flawed, maybe it's something that is harmful, but then it has this corrective mechanism. It gives people choices to exactly uphold the value that the OG wanted to have. But then I'm going to take the trade-off. What if democracy is created by the imposition of a certain group, Western countries, yada, yada, yada? Why then this is still something that principally virtue, right? Because understand, value and morality is not determined by their intent. Because the creation of morality is gauged by the utility upon the characterization of that subject. What does it mean? It means that maybe a creation of lie that people does could be deemed as as a virtue and as a moral thing to do, or morally desirable, because it has utility for you to create white lies, for instance, or the creation of tools that might kill people to begin with the intent of war and whatsoever. But right now, there's utility for daily use and daily necessity. It proves that in terms of determining morality, like universally, what people see is not necessarily the intent or the possibility of harm this thing could cause, but then the utility could eventually outweigh the harms, proving the fact that we have corrective mechanism, proving the fact that we could give choices to individual in and of itself prove that this subject of democracy is a virtue and moral. This is important because understand, number one, this principal argument, irrespective of the outcome of Western imposition whatsoever, prove that by value, moral, democracy could be deemed as something that is a virtue. But second of all, it also gauges with the spirit of motion. The debate about morality, whether or not by value and the imposition of value in and of itself is something that's correct. We've proven that also. So in principle, we win. Second of all, let's engage to the idea of practical. What does the world would look like? Basically, what we're trying to say is about Western imposition, bad democratic practice, yada, yada. First of all, we're trying to prove, right? This type of Western imposition whatsoever happens in a world or in the places where people are suffering in the absence of this imposition. But the question becomes that how then we gauge suffering, right? Because it is subjective, right? But there is an empirical evidence why these people are suffering to begin with. If Kushay want to engage to study case, let's engage to study case in political reality, right? So these people literally deprived from food. These people literally deprived from economic capacity to exercise what they wanted to do. If they are not deemed as a good citizen by the government, they will be killed, and they would be jailed, sentences, and whatsoever. This proves that there is an empirical evidence that these people are indeed suffering. So we agree. This is important because we agree that these people that the burden of government side of the house might not to prove why then dictatorship is good, but their burden is to prove why then the absence of democracy is not harmful when we prove otherwise. What is our comparative then, ladies and gentlemen? Understand our comparative is that democracy could be applied universally because there is an inherent characteristic of democracy that they eventually forgot. Because democracy could adapt to the culture and the needs of the society within it. This is because what deems democratic is not only always voting and the government system that is rigid and whatsoever, no thank you, but it could be tailored to the culture and the needs of these tribal leaders and whatsoever. This means, ladies and gentlemen, democracy by value and by practical practice could be universally applied. Like how then the regional leaders election of Indonesia is not always by voting because the constitution never told you so, but what people deem democratically within that region. It means that it could be universally applicable as not circumstantial to a certain places that wanted democracy. So we've proven the burden thrown by opening government within democracy should be universal. But second of all, they say that about they say things about how then democratic practice exists. Number one, there's a corrective mechanism. If you're talking about Merkel, Trump, Hitler, whatsoever, people topple down these people eventually, and at some point in life when they eventually suffer. But what the most important thing is that they have choices to do so. This agency is the most important thing to exercise what they wanted to have. You cannot dictate that these people wanted to have like democratically in Germany is something that is bad, because understand that it might be something good. But if it's something bad, eventually they would eventually have the capability to topple down this. But second of all, exactly, putting democracy on pedestal makes these Western countries need to eventually apply democracy that is working to this like Middle Eastern countries and whatsoever, because they have the incentive structure to prove that democracy is the best value and whatsoever. This narrative is necessary to hold USA accountable, to hold all of those colony accountable for democratizing literally MENA countries, right? Without this, regretting this narrative, these people will just let loose, and you have to figure it out yourself. So if you want to talk about political reality, we say it's better on our side. I'm very proud. So.
All right, thank you, the LO, for that fine speech. Now to open the case of CG and the closing half of the debate, I would like to call upon member of government here.
Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. All right. If you want to be OI, just unmute yourself and ask me questions. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's regrettable that this is a principle debate, but no one talks about principle, no one talks about philosophy. We're going to be the only team that talks about philosophy, and we're going to recontextualize what's the meaning of virtue, what's the meaning of a priori, or basically in and of itself, and what's the meaning of democracy, and what's the supposed goal. That's what we want to do in closing government. What's the burden of proof of team government, right? if I can prove to you that there are goals beyond democracy, that it can got hurt because of democracy in some contexts, even in one context, we win this debate. Our main case will directly clash with opening opposition that frame agency as God, that frame agency as the absolute end goal of individual's life, of humanity in general. This is what I'm going to pose it, right? The first part of my speech will talk about definition. OG failed to do this, that's why I need to fill it. First of all, what's the definition I'll talk about? What is the virtue in and of itself? Two elements to it. It is a priori, it's not a posteriori. It means that it's an absolute truth without testing, right? It's an absolute truth without necessary, you need to have a logical explanation to it. It's an intrinsic correct. It's not an axiom, accepted correctness, but it's an intrinsic correctness, right? That's a virtue in and of itself. Secondly, what does it mean for it to be a virtue? It's an end, not a means. So there's no other purpose beyond that, right? So for example, democracy is a virtue, meaning that there's no purpose beyond democracy. What's the narrative that we prefer? That democracy is a tool in a toolbox to reach a goal beyond it, right? It means that you can use democracy in certain contexts to achieve that ultimate goals, but in other cases, if you don't think it's necessary, then you don't need to use the tool, right? So what should be a basic virtue then? This is the second part of my speech. We'll talk about what is the alternative. We think what should be a virtue is only when it fulfills two basic things. The first thing is an intrinsic and innate nature of humankind to desire those things. That means that, for example, food, that's intrinsic, right? Because that's tied into our biological processes, which is not tied in to agency. Secondly, it's the virtue of what should be a virtue is when it fulfills the characterizations of universalizability. That means that it can be put anywhere, in any context, in any time frame, and it's still an intrinsic desire anyway. So what should be a virtue then? We think that what should be a virtue is human rights and the continuations of mankind to reproduce and multiply. And that's why we fight for basic foods, basic necessities for people and everyone to be able to do this, and for everyone to be able to reproduce, for everyone to be able to multiply. And this is what intrinsic, and this is what's universalizable, because that's intrinsic nature of our existence as a species, as life itself, not something that we construct ourselves and think beyond of our species existence. And that's what we think should be the main goal beyond democracy.
Okay.
Then the burden of team government is to prove if democracy can hurt this end goal, even in one context, we win. Before proving this burden, Akbar.
So if these people in the absence of democracy cannot eat and cannot, like, substantially, exercise their intrinsic needs, do you think that that condition in of itself is bad?
Yes, and that's why we think there's a lot of tools in the box to be able to provide the basic necessities, right? And that's not only democracy. And we can prove to you that if democracy can hurt that goal, even in one context, then it becomes a virtue in and of itself, because it's not reaching the other end of the virtue. And that's why we take the debate if we can prove that. We agree with OO that democracy is not election. We agree that our local adaptation to democracy, and we agree that we're not debating about a flawed democracy, that OO needs to defend a perfect democracy, not a flawed one. And that's why I think opening government have really went out of the way in this debate to talk about the flawed democracy that is happening in status quo. We agree that that's what opening opposition is to defend, and that's what we want to attack, right? We agree that the key tenets of democracy is only agency. So that's what we're going to attack. Why can't agency in democracy be a virtue in and of itself? I think it's because it can contradict the more inherent and intrinsic nature of the virtue, which is the socio-economic rights, human rights, and continuations of humankind. So what is the element of democracy that can structurally harm this? Note that this is structurally harm this, meaning that it can happen in some context because a structural way, but it may not happen in a perfect context where it can be an effective tool in the toolbox. But there are other models of governance that can be a useful tool in the toolbox as well. So what is the element of democracy? The agency is we think that can harms the continuations of mankind in a certain way. We think that exercising choice is a luxury, right? In a democracy, I think in a framing that we think that agency is a god, that agency is the sole purpose of human life, what we do is that people think they have free will. People think that they would be able to choose, and the choice that they make, the collective choice that they make, and the aggregate one, if we're talking about democracy, is you are able to make this choice, right? Meaning society will be able to make this choice. We think free will does not exist in a vacuum. It's not a God-given right. You can only think within the confinement of your own imagination. That means that in a certain context where not everyone can exercise free will or freedom, some society wouldn't be able to determine that goals individually. That is correlated with a level of education, which means that the ability for you to construct a rational choice and informed consent would only exist if you fulfill a certain level of education. Religion, culture, these things plays a part, right? Because there are also a level of hierarchy. That means that the relationship, the socio-economic relationship between you and your parents, for example, that also this construct your imagination and the imagination an illusion of choice itself. So if we can prove to you that in countries where level of education is low and when there's a lot of hierarchy that manipulates you into thinking that you make this choice but you didn't, that means that this agency is not a god but something that can endanger us, because these people might vote out of their needs, out of their way to even attack the other groups' needs or even their own needs. Because, for example, they voted for capitalism, they voted for less regulation when it can harm them in the process, right? The second element of democracy is that I think it's because collective rights can trump collective survival. What do I mean by this? This means that an aggregate choice of individuals in the process of democracy, in the process of discourse that are flawed to begin with, because individuals not having this conception beyond their imaginations, meaning that they are able to frame the discussions and discourses correctly towards the survival of the species. Sometimes they won't. And that's why we believe that democracy has elements that may falter the achievement of these goals. And we think that's why it cannot be in virtue. We beg to propose. Sorry, Kalaman.
Thank you very much for the member of government for that fine speech. Now to open the case of closing opposition, I'd like to call upon member of opposition here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. My preferred POI method is out. So just unmuting yourselves. Okay. Starting my speech. Okay, sorry. Nervous. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 points of setup and framing. Firstly, we don't think we need to defend democracy as a perfect entity in the application of the word, ladies and gentlemen, but as a virtue, we are going to prove you that it's principally correct and it's morally desirable. And it's as a direction that people needs to aspire to a perfect democracy and a perfect world. We don't need to prove whether the perfection exists. We need to prove to you that it's about the direction that this narrative drives. That is what's morally desirable. Secondly, the existence of this narrative, it drives to the people, right? But thirdly, the virtue of democracy, and we're going to extend O's case in this, the virtue of democracy doesn't only come in democratic countries, but it also comes from everywhere. Because it's the ways that people live, and it's how people in communities work, ladies and gentlemen. We say the absence of democracy and its principles and democratic values will lead to communities everywhere not being able to work, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to understand that in both, and we are living in a world where different political ideologies exist, ladies and gentlemen. So people have different opinions, different ideas of what their rights should be. So I don't think CG's framing is actually creditable, ladies and gentlemen, although it's very beautiful, because individuals have different definition of what rights they should have. As a communist, I think everyone should have different rights as a pro-capitalist, for example. So this means that on their side of the house, the people who lives in communities do not have moderation that democracy provides to you. I'm going to prove to you later, extend to that. So I'm going to talk about the characterizations of democracy. This is also something that was absent from OO. 4 points in here. Firstly, the moderation that democracy gives you, ladies and gentlemen. And this is important, right? Because differences of ideologies, differences of ideas that exist in, especially in communities, especially in large communities, for example. Moderation exists in democracies because, for example, no, thank you. When you win elections, for example, you are not only the president of the people who voted for you, but you are the president of the entire nation, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, communal concerns and grievances. This is also a principle of democracy, ladies and gentlemen, because governments, for example, and communities solve communal problems. People working together and solving communal problems using policies, for example, policies that the people themselves wanted, for example, right? Thirdly, transparency and serving back the power to the people, ladies and gentlemen. This is actualized when in democratic countries where all people have the ability, have the right to protest against something, for example, right? Fourthly, critiques and inputs, ladies and gentlemen, and this is important in democratic countries, right? With the existence of free media, for example, and other inputs into the government. But before that, the point.
This is a narrative debate, and narrative is about simplification. Why is it good when democracy is always the first thing you go for when other countries can benefit from like the one-party system?
The narrative was a drive that drives people to a certain direction. I'm going to prove to you why that direction of the 4 principles that I've told you is more preferred than any sort of comparative that exists, any sort of communal way people can live, ladies and gentlemen. So talking about why this is principally just virtue, ladies and gentlemen, right? Because we live in a world where people are divided, right? Democracies is not only about majority wins, like what OG wanted to tell you, right, ladies and gentlemen, because democracies constantly reevaluates itself. It always takes in more input from social media, for example. It gives you critique, the ability to critique. It has check and balance systems, trias politica in Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen. This proves to you that even though majority wins, even though Trump wins, for example, there is always the right for people to protest. There is always the right for CNN and other news media to protest that, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that's comparatively better than any sort of governmental system that government wanted to portray. And note that the comparative that OG wanted to defend was like very arbitrary. They wanted to defend China, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know. I'm going to prove you why that's comparatively worse. But note that even though that it creates the like noise, for example, it creates arrest, it creates problems, it creates not stable, for example, it's perfectly justified because that is actually people's opinions. That is actually minorities who, for example, are benefiting from the majority of the people, for example. That's people who are voices are not being heard as much, or the policies are not being catered to, for example, ladies and gentlemen. This proves to you that the minorities are only able to have agency in democracy. And this is important, especially in a communal sense, ladies and gentlemen, where states needs to operate in this communal sense, where any sort of community needs to operate in this communal sense. That is preferred, but not only on a grand macro scale, ladies and gentlemen, but on a smaller level. For example, the way the way your parents listen to you when you are giving them input. For example, your parents are a position of power than you, for example, right? But your parents wanted to hear input, for example. You're electing the ketua class for your class, for example, right, ladies and gentlemen, gathering up votes. That is a way communities work, ladies and gentlemen. So we want to respond OG as well in this, right? Because they wanted to defend that there are other government systems like communal ways of living from traditional Asian ways, ladies and gentlemen. That also is preferable because there is the principle and the value of democracy within that, ladies and gentlemen. It may be not the democratic government, but the way you the way communalities and the way you hear everyone's rights, and everyone has the same right and opinions, and everyone's getting heard. That is the principle and the value of democracy, ladies and gentlemen. So the comparative on their side wasn't people living communal together and hearing what everyone has to say, because that's also democratic values. So what was the comparative on their side when they defended China being stable, for example? That is because of dictatorship. That's because of suppression. That's because there is no transparency, for example. There is no governmental checks, for example. And that's the comparative that OG was very happy to defend, right? Because they say China was stable. Yes, they were stable because the Uyghur, for example, did not have exposures to the media, for example. Yes, there is relative stability because they also manipulated the data from COVID, ladies and gentlemen, making the notion that they are stable, while in actuality they're not. The notion that the OG fell into, ladies and gentlemen, was proving exactly why agency was important, why the principles and why the democracy needed to stand for. We are proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, member of opposition, for that fine speech. Now to close the government bench, I would like to call upon government whip here.
Check, am I audible? Hello? Check, am I audible?
Yeah, bro.
Oh, okay. Sorry, no one was saying anything. First of all, I would like to say I'm very grateful to having a speech inside of the grand final of ProAms. I'm going to cherish every single moment of my speech, but I'll also thank you for educators and observers inside of the debate community. Love you all. I don't have any specific gender pronouns. If you guys really want to POI, please do it through chat, but I cannot promise I will take any POI, and also please do it considerably because I don't like to get interrupted. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. As government whip, my job here is simple, right? I'm going to adjudicate the debate why in the end of the day CG deserves to be first. So my speech will be divided into 2 parts. The first one, why in the end of the day all of the opposition bench cannot simply get the champion of ProAms, and secondly, why in the end of the day CG is the only bench that can perceive towards the ProAms in the end of the day. But first of all, simple clarification that will inherently engage towards the case of both closing opposition and opening opposition in the end of the day, right? The way member of opposition simply dismiss the amazing argument of my member is simply because it is not what we are actually debating about. But this is very weird because they simply cannot run under the burden of proof why in the end of the day the philosophical of an analysis of my member is inherently wrong in the end of the day. I think they are just so scared because my member speech is just that amazing, right? But sure, I'm going to clarify again why in the end of the day my member speech is still going to be relevant in this debate in the end of the day, right? Because on the idea of principle level, is that this democracy may harm human survival in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. And why in the end of the day? And it is going to be a popular narrative. It is going to be that bad. We need to look into account on what will happen. What does the narrative is going to be look like, right? The idea of this narrative of virtue is that you are going to have a very excellent trait in the end of the day. People are going to see it as an amazing thing, but this is something which is inherently wrong, right? Because an honest person, for example, cannot be identified simply as one who, for example, practices honest stealing and doesn't cheat in the end of the day. If it happened merely because it is the best for them, their fear of time of through the process in the end of the day, it is simply not true virtueable in the end of the day, right? Which is probably also what opening opposition and closing opposition principal argument is. Their main argument is not the debate, not what we're talking about, because we're not talking about whether or not democracy is good or bad or the correct version of democracy in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't think you can contribute their principal arguments in that way. What does opening opposition and closing opposition talks about, right? Their main principle is on the idea why in the end of the day people will utilize this type of principle and mechanization in the end of the day. notice that this is not defending the idea of virtue of democracy in itself. They're defending the idea of virtue, the mechanization of democracy, and the tool in itself. In the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, they're not discussing why in the end of the day democracy to begin with is something which is inherently good. In the end of the day, they only agree on the idea democracy can be inherently good if it's actually in the end of the day can be utilized to be something which is completely good. But the burden of proof that government brings in the end of the day is not about that. It's about how first is how my member have told you, it applies universally and unconditionally, even in low educated and high religious areas. If this type of perspective and narrative actually going to exist, the next impact is that it will make choices that harms humanity's survival, right, ladies and gentlemen? For example, A, they are going to kill in the name of democracy in the end of the day, or B, they are going to vote for harmful policies in the end of the day. They will eventually kill people and harm individuals in the end of the day. So I don't think all opposition bench can win in this debate because their principle is inherently that bad, and they cannot simply take the burden. Why in the end of the day this type of democratic society, when they actually did this type of actions, can be justified as a very principal thing in the end of the day. And my member is the only team under the government's case to explain beautifully why inherently it is something which is very good, right? My member told us why in the end of the day free will doesn't necessarily exist, and so on and so forth. But and sure, why in the end of the day CGs is going to win this case, right? I think this is one of the biggest throw ups of the further impacts, right? Because I think the idea of principle, yeah, CG just completely win in this debate. Let's talk about the impacts, which is also exists under OG, CG, and ONCO. I think it is more comparative, and why in the end of the day CG is far better, right? On the idea of OG, they only talks about why in the end of the day it is going to only exist under democracy and politics in the end of the day, right? While CG said that it is going to be beyond that because it is going to harm other sectors which exist inside of every single layer in society in the end of the day. Why? Because we say the idea of democracy is not necessarily the end, but it is only going to be a starting point, just like what CEO said. But the way they actually going to utilize this starting point is going to be very different, right? How? Because under opposition case, where democracy going to be manifested, is where this exists under layer of, I don't know, healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. We need to take it into account about one thing when this democracy is going to be seen as something which is a virtue, right? Number one is that every single action which where the narrative is going to be that big, every single action in the name of democracy is going to be justified. But not only that, the idea of when you actually commit something on the idea of democracy is also is really hard for you to actually go up against, right? Because simply the idea of narrative is that the idea of narrative under opposition case is that this type of individual, or whatever type of actors is going to commit under democracy in the end of the day is not is simply going to be exist in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Well, comparatively, under a CG's case, we say not only under democratic or political view, but also on other layers, right? For example, the interaction between individuals or religious manners in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, how people is going to be more careful in the end of the day to actually take this type of steps in the end of the day. How? Because currently, almost every single actions in which we are actually committing a crime or actually we are committing something which is completely inherently bad is in the name of democracy in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. How? Because we agree on the idea of opposition or whatever bench that actually says it is that the idea of democracy is highly contingent to the individuals in itself, but it also tells us that the idea of this type of interpretation is also going to be different as the lots of layers of society going to necessarily exist, ladies and gentlemen, which is why in the end of the day we cannot simply yeah, whatever, it's just going to be that bad. But moreover, we say on the idea of defend democracy is perfect, why it is going to be that much of a burden under opposition, right? Because in order for you to actually make something as good as a virtue where it is completely narrative, going to exist in a narrative inside of everyone's head, we say it needs some parameter, right? And my member have already told you those type of parameter. For example, like number one, it cannot simply harm other human beings in the end of the day. Number two, it is not on the ends of the debate. It is not the end in the end. But three, it is a priori, not posteriori. Therefore, very proud to give my 7 minute speech in ProAms. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Government Whip, for that fine speech. Now, to close the opposition bench and the overall debate, I would like to call upon Opposition Whip here.
Okay, I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, setting up timer. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. It's very important to dissect the principle of democracy and the practice of democracy, because that's the burden for us to explain that practice of democracy is always perfect. Then it is also completely impossible, and we can also throw that burden on whatever counterfactual that government proposed, because democracy in practice has been vilified by vices that humans create on their own, which we agree. Which is the system that society adopts, capitalism, you name it, the norms in a society, and everything else. But notice these things also exist on their side. So knowing that humans pose immediate threats to any systems, then the question would be, which principle offers the most virtues that can control this free will or whatnot, and how do we make sure that everyone can work collectively? The counterfactual on the government bench is then, assuming that both houses can achieve the most ideal form, then a governance run completely by one single government like they want puts the entire fates of that nation to one single person or institution that has free will on their own, without any possibility whatsoever to question or criticize the government. Because if they want to play under the scenario that democracy enables Trump and Hitler to win, we can also play the scenario that the governance that they believe in, that they believe is most virtuous, can also be corrupted by what the person in power believes in. Because literally, I just started my speech. Calm down. Because notice that nations that adopt democracy might practice it differently, shows to you that it's not the principles that are not virtuous, but the practice that strips the virtues away. And that's not what we defend. So knowing that humans might be the cause of why governance might not work in certain communities, then it's about governance and a system that best mitigates humans' ability to find their way around the system, and democratic principles offer just that. It's more than just the power of the people, agency, or whatnot, like what all claim, but they are exclusive features of democratic principles that are conveniently disregarded by OMA. 3 things. Number 1, it moderates different ideologies. We need to be realistic and admit the fact that, chat, please. I don't like to be interrupted. Sorry, I didn't clarify it first. But anyway, it moderates different ideologies. We need to accept that different ideologies will always exist, even in their perfect world, right? This is important because people have different outlook of life, and no matter how much you want people to be united, because people will always be divided. So how do we best maneuver in that situation? Democracy moderates the situation. Sure, collective interests are not always equal with everyone's interests, but democracy does not end when an administration is elected. At a glance, it seems unfair, indeed, that the minority has to succumb to the majority. But democracy states that an elected official does not only serve the constituents or the people who voted for you, but also the people in general. The reason why some win and some lose is because there are valid grievances that are felt more by certain groups of the people. Although it's regrettable that some people choose to shut down people who come from different backgrounds, but that's not what democracy entails. Democracy moderates these differences because democracy in its most ideal form encourages people to engage with one another with decorum instead of hate, because democracy believes that everyone is equal, a very, very specific principle that democracy entails. Historically speaking, this is also the reason why democratic values exist even in places that do not acknowledge democracies, because democracies are based on moderation and discourse. That's why people in the past decided to group, because they know alone they would literally die without any protection or mitigating factor that people can agree on that democracy provides. So moderation can exist in a world in which people believe that the system allows them to have one, and that will not exist in their world. Because the counterfactual in CG's world of achieving collective human rights is questionable, because in an unmoderated world in which people have different definitions of rights they should have, would have been a complete liberty, yes, but it's completely chaotic. Because the reason why we cannot engage with your case, because there is no counterfactual whatsoever of how to achieve a complete and universal achievement of equal human rights in a world in which differences are not moderated. Because if the society in your side believes that it is a universal right that the world should be purged of certain races and everything else, then there is no delta in your world, because voting for harmful policies or killing in the name of whatever principles OG or CG want to believe in can also still exist. So that's why the moderation is an exclusive virtue that democracy offers. Second, it addresses communal interests at large through transparent means. Through direct voting, people in power can identify what are things they should address immediately, because democratic principle allows people to share their voice. Their counterfactual is this single governance or whatever they want that allows itself to think on its own without any incentive to believe what's right for the people based on their immediate needs. If they are not voted, then there's literally no incentive for them to pander to the people they rule, because this system promotes self-righteousness of this ruler even more. Exactly because democracy allows moderation for different ideas, the ideal form of engagement is through education. OG brought up example about masks. On your side, people are obliged to wear masks without understanding why. The comparative on our side is, even if people might not want to wear masks at first, democracy allows people to communicate and educate one another that creates mutual understanding and supposedly empathy to understand where they're coming from. Then on their side, if the installed government also does not believe in wearing masks either, then the absolute truth that they will create will also not allow people to wear masks. So no delta whatsoever then. But if the scenario if the world that OG envisions has a person in power who listens to the people, is a democratic principle in and of itself. So you cannot have both on their side. You need to completely trash democratic principles to win. Democracy also entails transparency, that people in power should justify their decisions or choices to the people by clarifying the means, the resources, and the expected end. Government misusing transparency is an entirely different debate, because the practice and the people at play who do not align with principles are not part of democracy in and of itself. Another thing that democracy expects after transparency is that it requires comprehensive deliberation to understand the best approach to use, cost and benefit, and everything else considered. This is another feature that is virtuous, because it requires extensive deliberation to justify one thing is better than another, while at the same time considering all relevant elements. The counterfactual on their side is a government system that skips deliberation, because then what matters is just to get things done without having to justify to the people governed why a certain choice is made. Lastly, and most importantly, is it allows critics to the people in power or even larger system at play. It entails that no forms of government should abuse its power. That's why democracy creates a system that might be convoluted, but each tool has a role to play to make sure that everyone and everything is in check. That's why we say that it's a virtue that is only exclusive to democracy. So intrinsically speaking, the democratic principles are virtuous. Humans might hinder those things. Knowing that, which principles allow humans to achieve gratification? It's a set of principles that allow people to have a platform to speak, to be moderated, requires to be transparent, and things like that. And those things are intrinsic in democracy in any way. So democracy in and of itself is virtuous. Vote for closing opposition.
Okay, thank you all opposition for that fine speech, and that is the end of the debate. Congratulations everyone, and thank you for the great debate.